Lane to Cannon Town Station.
Okay, leave my right highway full onto my house tunnel. My house needs on all four fantastic way there, which is big circus still, driving the circus, all mining and fighting blocks. It's like a circus, then my Silvertown Lane, right to Silvertown Slipper.
Heading from Australian Organization to Paddington Station.
We've got right and turn, there are no doors, left is Catholic Street, left is West Street, right is Gospel Street, left is Drever, left is Holborn, forward is Princess Circus, forward is St. Giles High Street, right is Oxford Street, left is Yorkshire Street, forward St. Giles Circus, forward is Oxford Street, right is Gordon Street, left is Marcel.
That is from my station to the nearest right. You have drivers memory all that. Cannon Square. Island Road, Cannon Square, Lincoln Island Road, Burning Road, all West Crew Service, left by West Crew Service, up and lead by East Indians Road, left and right. Cannon Square, forward Colonnade, forward Cannon Square to the right.
Take me from the Palladium Theatre to Devonshire Square, please.
James, are you concentrating on the hill?
Various elements and try and tie things together perhaps as well. There's also probably quite a lot of crossover between people that were here yesterday and today. Were a lot of people here yesterday as well as today? So actually we might also want to refer back to some of the events that happened yesterday as well. It might be quite interesting and useful. Who wants to kick off? No, you could kick off.
I thought I could kick off. As I was listening, watching this Bee's film, I scribbled this down: saintly eyebrows. I think there was some images of absorption that Adrian was talking a little bit about yesterday, caught up in that film, which I found pretty compelling. Also, during today's event, I was sitting outside in the cafe and wandering around and just listening to bits and bobs that were happening, the different sounds, and listening to the way that the performances that were going on in the lower gallery kind of sort of helped the architecture of the ICA extend and endure in ways that you kind of don't expect architecture to. And I think it's one of those relationships between sound and space that we're kind of stuck with, that time and space and memory become odd, fleeting things. And whilst I was doodling, actually I was writing emails to somebody, I just remembered that Morton Feldman, he was describing a kind of practice of listening, and he just said, sort of, it kind of came rather out of the blue, when you're listening for the uninfluential. And for a while I've been trying to figure out exactly what that might mean. And I saw it again here, and it was to do with expressions, I think. Once I saw Daniel Barenboim playing Beethoven Sonata at the Festival Hall, and he was playing it with such a kind of... it seemed that he was also trying to demonstrate not only the music and unfold it and sort of put it in into his musical vocabulary, but he was also trying to tell you something about how well he knew it. And at one point during the performance, he winked at the audience. And he fell out of my chair. It was kind of Liberace kind of gesture, but at the same time, it was extremely awesome, I think is probably the right word for it. And the levels of intensity and concentration that we've seen in Bee's performance here is something which I think reprises across the kinds of ways that we've been trying to engage with Cardew's music here, and pay attention not only to scores but performances, and to the extraneous or extra-diegetic is my favourite word for that, noises that come into and out of your consciousness. And those obviously, but those I think form new kinds of objects of attention in interesting ways. A long time ago, I was standing outside Goldsmiths College, taking a break from work, leaning up against the building, smoking, and all of a sudden I got washed over by this very odd sensation, which kind of happens periodically. It was like a bit of a memory of a breeze or something. There's some kind of texture to it. Something I remembered about my dad, and also some kind of feeling of well-being. It was a kind of kinesthetic experience. It brought all these odd things together, which I could never find words for. But they were fabrics and textures and pieces which assembled themselves very much as a kind of reality, I think, which I had to pay some kind of attention to. There's a very powerful, affective sort of moment there. And I wouldn't say that necessarily listening to Cardew's music or listening to performances of the kinds of music that we're interested in and talking about and listening to today and paying attention to, I don't think those pieces of music necessarily precipitate those kinds of odd affective experiences which you have to struggle to hold together and find words for. But I would say that they were paralleled. And I think one of the things that Bee's film has done is to produce that kind of odd set of relationships which you're kind of stumped for, these little excesses between string music, speaking, intensity, and what might exist already as sets of images for that. And in that case, saintly eyebrows as an image of a kind of concentration has an almost Sufi-like kind of character to it, which might maybe some way into thinking about how the music we've been listening to over the weekend exists. I can stop.
I was thinking about paying attention and how the paying aspect of it. It's funny, we've been talking about attention, or we haven't been talking, we've been talking about different modes of attention over the weekend, but we kind of haven't been talking about paying. I mean, it came up a little bit, and I was just wondering about, I have this other set of thoughts related to Cardew, which is to do with the economy and various different ways of thinking about economies in relationship to his work, and the avoidance of the economic in many ways that goes on in his work, and how that might relate. And And by economy, obviously I mean a kind of general cultural sense of economy, but also on a very pragmatic way. I'm talking about the fiscal economy as well, and the way in which work is supported and how it's supported, and all the different types of support that might be considered in that regard. And one of the things that I've been thinking of, I very sadly had to miss the earlier performances today, but all the other performances, and also thinking about Ultra Red a lot over this weekend. I've been thinking about the kind of aesthetic arrangement, the aesthetic arrangements that we've been witnessing. So that on one level, one walks into the lower gallery at the ICA and participates in a set of aesthetic arrangements of bodies and spaces and objects, loads of bread, you know, microphones, pencils hanging on the wall, ready to kind of mark sheets of paper. And one becomes very aware of how one has to insert one's own body into that aesthetic arrangement. And on one level, of course, one's supposed to be able to do that easily. The aesthetic arrangement of the space is explicitly done in order that we can insert our bodies easily into it. But at the same time, it's a bit difficult because, and we talked a lot yesterday about embarrassment, it's a bit embarrassing, or we're not quite sure what to do, we're not quite sure whether we should go to the table or not. And actually, earlier on in the coffee break today, I was told off for kind of hovering around the coffee table, but not actually sitting down. I got kind of, you know, slapped on the knuckles for not kind of performing properly in some way. And I felt really bad, actually. I felt like I had been a naughty girl at school. And I wondered about, but somehow the aesthetic arrangement in the lower gallery today of Ultra Red and yesterday in many ways reminded me of the images we have of the Scratch Orchestra. I mean, partly they're explicitly photographed. So, and the film at the drawing room at the moment that's on display absolutely shows us that kind of aesthetic arrangement of bodies and spaces with objects, some of those objects being instruments, some of them being children, some of them being kind of vehicles, etc., etc. But also, there's a kind of a sense in which that arrangement of bodies and spaces is partly fantasized as well. We have a fantasy about that. And we have a fantasy about that in relationship to certain types of politics. We think of democratic arrangements of space. And we feel like we're trying to enable that in some way. And I come away thinking, on one hand, deeply kind of implicated and wanting to join in, and on the other hand, not quite sure how to. And I come away with that feeling. And I wonder about the political productivity of that, because whilst on one level one could say, well, that's not good, Andrea, if you didn't feel like you could join in, that means it hasn't been sufficient. But on the other hand, I kind of think, well, maybe something about the fact that I didn't, maybe there's some kind of critical form going on in there. I'm interested in that. That's the extent of all I can say about it at the moment. You are nodding away.
Like a nodding bell. I think
yes, exactly like a nodding.
some of my thoughts, I'd like to think obviously are in dialogue with and speak to these issues around what we refer to in terms of immersion, and also I think what you're referring to as embodiment that may well lead to issues of politics, maybe of body politics of some kind, and also maybe to issues of economy. But the thing that struck me since I arrived yesterday afternoon is that where in my head I started in terms of trying to think of ways in which terms, concepts to try and sort of think perhaps theoretically about this kind of an event, that right at the end of the film, not knowing that the film was going to end at that moment, I had the same thought and wrote it down as I had when I first started. I kind of come full circle, which was interesting. And essentially in terms of trying to think theoretically about something like the work of Cardew and think about his graphic scores and his improvisation, to try and sort of, you have to start somewhere, so take an impetus in terms of look at the environment, look at the space, think about your relationship to that space, and take perhaps the idea of the score and sort of explode that to some extent and think about surfaces of legibility, surfaces of inscription. We're surrounded by them. The score is an instance of that, whether it's conventional, whether it's graphic. The film is an instantiation of that. Writing in our notes is an instantiation of that. And there's certain things that keep cropping up for me, which one of which fundamentally is not merely the surfaces of inscription themselves, but actually the use of certain tools and techniques and gestures which the Cardew performances this afternoon really kind of very clearly, to my mind, sort of demonstrates something of the kind of manual nature of the activity of performing, and the material nature of performing those kinds of works in terms of the brute materiality of say, not in this afternoon's performance in terms of like stones, using stones, but I mean in terms of found objects, in terms of non-conventional instrumentation, and the very way in which the body, in this very immersive and very kind of embodied sense, makes use of certain techniques and, in a broad sense, kind of technologies. And I don't necessarily just mean technologies in the sense of iPods, although an iPod was used in the performance of, as I recall, paragraph 6. And what I'm particularly interested in is this idea of thinking, well, what is knowledge, and how can we think about knowledge in a way that doesn't simply sort of totalise, that takes a lead from the kind of improvisation dimensions of this kind of work.
Yeah.
What might that look like? How might that work in determinacy, improvisation? And what I keep kind of coming up with in my mind is something to do with, well, kind of techniques and techniques, technologies in a very sort of loose and broad sense, including these kinds of implements, but also the kinds of things that we saw in the performances today. And throughout the film, the constant close-ups of very kind of anxiously held pens, which somehow were kind of like an embodiment of the immersive nature of that knowledge practice, that knowledge exercise, which fundamentally also is collective. And somewhere between these various different sort of coordinates of technique and tool and inscription and recording is a link between the activity of a body and a collective interaction, which may be taking the lead from the school, from the Great Learning in terms of the kind of topography. If you think of the mapping of London as topographic, well, think of the body as topography as illustrated in the school from the Great Learning, and you've got a sense of an idea of perhaps a body politic. So if it's a question of trying to think politically what may be prescient in terms of these kinds of works for today, then maybe that's something to possibly think about.
It's interesting. I was very struck in Bea's film about the kind of vulnerability of the fact that there's a kind of collective wishing, to succeed that's going on in many ways in that film, and yet we all know that they're going to leave, or they're either in. I don't quite know how the knowledge works, so B might come back to us with some technical information. That that at some point they're going to leave and be on their own. And coincidentally, I was in a taxi on Friday, and apart from talking about how the recession is really hitting taxi drivers and how it's a kind of fragile, precarious existence, same as many places are at the moment, he was also saying, actually, I was saying, well, do you enjoy being a taxi driver? And he said, well, actually, the one thing I can't cope with is the loneliness. The loneliness of the taxi driver, the loneliness of the one that's the driver, all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking that, so when I was watching, I was thinking about how these bodies are going to be dispersed all over London, and they're going to lose that kind of very interesting and different types of knowledge.
Yes.
Knowledges and the knowledge.
It's an odd form of the petit bourgeois. Yeah. Where that knowledge comes from. What I was getting while I was watching that, and I've been getting all day, is the way that the music's and proposals, once you start giving them a political ground, and you start thinking, well who exactly then are going to provide these epistemes from the materials we're looking at? I get the impression of affinities being suggested, but not the elective affinities that we're used to speaking about. They're much more propositional. Yeah. Here's just a suggestion of how these things could connect, and then that's as far as it can go at the moment. It doesn't produce much of an economy, though.
No, it doesn't. But we have to think about it in relationship. Yeah. Francis and John, anything to come in? Something completely different.
Well, with my hat on as a lecturer in composition at
Oh yeah, a musician.
Yeah, kind of. I think what does this stuff mean to us? And especially, it's been a weird weekend because yesterday we kind of started the last decade of Cardew, which I find a bit depressing, really, for a number of reasons. And there's this quote which was framed today, which was about Cardew kind of throwing out the whole of the avant-garde and saying, we might as well get together and sing the internationality together. That's much more useful. And I think, that's so sad. And you turn on the telly and you see Simon Cowell and he says to the finalists, and the best comment he can give is saying, you're commercial. And they think, oh, I'm commercial. That's it. There's plenty of people doing PhDs in composition out there who none of my students and none of But, you know, quite often I've been examining people being upgrading from their MPhils to PhD in composition, and it's as if, you know, Cage, Cardew, etc., Pierre Schaeffer, Mauritia, but none of that ever happened. And it's extraordinary, and they absolutely have the same worldview as Beethoven. I mean, they really do. So when I make a comment about their work, and they'll tell me I'm wrong. I failed as a listener. It's very much in line with the text by Milton Babbitt, Who Cares If You Listen, which is about this kind of really kind of fuck-off statement to the audience, you know, to specialist stuff. And then we come to a day like today, and you think, gosh, this stuff's absolutely vital. This approach to composition, this kind of this search for a kind of democracy, but still there's this kind of composer's hand kind of hovering above it. And then thinking about my role as a listener as well, thinking, what do I find important, and and then going back to that kind of Cage quote about the sobering quality. But not all of the stuff we heard was sobering, it was very emotional as well.
Yeah.
Paragraph 3 was, you know, it's very emotional, the huge waves that kind of washed over us. And there's that process going on with the performance of listening and sound making kind of simultaneously, which is kind of very strong listening process, which I find quite profound. And I really think this stuff is, you know, forget Cardew's kind of throwaway statement of the avant-garde. It's really important. This stuff, I mean, just to frame my kind of perspective, I'm particularly involved with the field of soundscape studies and acoustic ecology. And I was at a huge conference in Edinburgh the other week called Euronoise, which has had 1,000 acousticians and European bureaucrats and government consultants. And there's a huge discussion now about legislation of the soundscape. There's actually trying to legislate what sounds we hear in the environment and how they, and it's absolutely terrifying. I had some artistic interventions which were pretty dramatically unsuccessful, but it was just, you know, you should make all these people, because they clearly aren't listeners. These people aren't, you know, they're desperate to measure. There's this whole new thing of tranquility measurements, you know, this kind of formula for measuring tranquility, which is complete madness. But you think, oh, look, people, stop presenting all your peer-reviewed papers about how to measure tranquility, and let's sit down and do a performance of one of the chapters of the Great Listening, of the Great Line.
Great Listening.
Great Listening, sorry. And I just want to stress, you know, it's been great because it's kind of reminding me how vital this stuff is. How, you know, it's been great to hear it being presented really well. Maybe it's almost a bit too beautiful, the performances. I wasn't there in the 60s, I don't know how in the early 70s how it heard.
There was a bit when I was sitting outside drinking coffee, and the toilet door kept banging against this background, this music unfolding, and as this bang kind of carried on, kept going, it gained more grandeur, took on a kind of life in the music itself, and if something legislated against that door bang, you'd been screwed. It would never have happened.
Yeah, I was very conscious of those noises when John Tilbury was playing yesterday as well.
Yeah. Irritating and,
well, you know, or not.
I mean, there's great moments just towards the end of those, a couple of the performances, you know, especially the great learning chapter 6, where it kind of fell apart at the end. It's like, is it finished yet? It was really entering that kind of avant-garde, awkward moment of it. You start clapping, what's happened? Which is great. And then you start kind of listening, and people are aware of each other, and it's kind of very sociable. Laughter, and very
the laughter in B's film was extraordinary as well. The moments where they corpse, which relates back to our conversation yesterday about embarrassment. These kind of moments. From talking theatre, corpsing the acting.
as I listened to this stuff, I remember what was going on and what I think about what I learned from it. Because listening to the first piece today, I was astonished by my own tendency to become a total dictator as an artist was particular. And I remember Cornelius's dictatorship. I remember what was going on with Cornelius as a communist, which was incredibly dictatorial. And I was very critical of it, and I had some terrible arguments and rows about it. And thinking through, some of the ultra-red stuff yesterday, I began to think about resilience and the capacity to deal with this cacophony of difference that we have. and yet to understand that we are all dependent and create structures with which we deal with it, and some of those structures are loathsome and some are wonderful, and we can't kind of avoid it. So the appearance of democracy is sort of mediated by the fact that we're all using complex structures which are in maybe competition with each other. And so sitting there today in that first paragraph we heard, I was astonished by the tensions between the dictation of the proletariat, which I experienced, and the capacity of that work to give people a space. And thinking about musicians too, I mean, for theatre it's a bit different. Musicians who are accustomed to being in orchestras, I mean, it was kind of hugely revolutionary moments for them to be able to go into those structures and to make but nevertheless a structure. So this sort of balance that we strike, and the role of the artist at any particular moment, and we were talking about it, weren't we? What decision you make about who you're working with and how you work with them, and are they a collaborator or are they the object of something of what you're doing, and how you think that's true, and how reflexive you need to be about this. And so in the end, I suppose I sort of come up with a rather pathetic view that we need to think about it quite a lot and try. I'm sorry, I'm just a simple theatre worker, and
don't leave that for a moment.
well, it's bizarre. It's a bizarre feeling because you have to inhabit and to try and develop the resilience to do that. My experience when this work was being created was extremely savage and ferocious, quite often, and the level of struggles and arguments that went on were quite savage, actually, and were very strengthening, if you like, I realised afterwards. So if I came out of those experiences and with a commitment to whatever I perceive as democracy, I also learned that might slip and slide around a great deal, and that I have to kind of be tough enough to cope with that as an artist. And then the relationship between my position as an artist, my position as a political activist, continually shifting. And today I thought, well, of course I would give up the art if I thought that the political activity would work all by itself. At certain points I have done, and it hasn't, of course, worked, except for a few minutes or a few days or a few weeks or 6 months or something. So whatever this jabber is about, it feels like there are so many things going on. And one of the things I did find in those pieces, and I'm sure other people did, was that it released a lot of thinking, and that they released an enormous amount of thinking and reflecting, some of which was completely unexpected for me, as if there was a kind of lovely space in them. And we saw some of that space in there, within the framework of the knowledge, where those taxi drivers actually transcended something and achieved this kind of collective, which was not just about their earning a living. It was about some connection which they then, as you say, lost. And I was at the Brecht Benjamin symposium a couple of weeks ago at Birkbeck, and apparently Brecht and Benjamin, you would know this better than I, because I'm not highly theorised, talked about something missing, which is what is more than the sum of the parts. And I began to think a lot about that in relation to Cornelius's work, and maybe all of our work.
I think that you know, when you say I'm a humble theatre worker.
Not humble, I'm not humble.
No, right, not humble.
I'm simple, but not
simple.
humble.
Simple, humble, completely separate things. I think. Simple theatre worker, but you summarise so adequately exactly what. I mean, I guess in a sense it's the same as you've been saying, that all we can do at this particular moment after a weekend of events is say this allows us, or is exemplary, or offers us an exemplary moment of the necessity to think in quite complex ways, and to remember that that's an important thing to do, and to somehow utilise that as a model of behaviour or something. For a long time we've talked about Cardew as an exemplary figure, a complex exemplary figure, and sometimes exemplary of the things that seem very dictatorial, very kind of patriarchal in many ways. Adrian talked about that. We began to talk about that a little bit yesterday. But what does it mean to be exemplary? What does it mean to now Cardew's not here, and you know, maybe if he was here, then he would be, you know, writing Beethoven sonatas somewhere, and we would cease to be interested in him. I think that that's the case. But you know, how can we inhabit that exemplarity? And is that the right thing to do? I mean, these are questions that seem to me to be political questions.
There's a very well-known Roland Barthes essay called Listening, and right at the beginning of it, he makes a distinction between listening and hearing, and sort of has this idea of hearing as a kind of animal thing, feral, adrenalized, sitting on the edge of your seat, kind of, you know, ready to run away. That's why he says it's animals. But what he's meaning, I think, is listening to concert performances of, you know, classical repertoire. And on the other side, he has a civic kind of idea of listening, which is paying attention. The metaphor he used for it was the psychoanalyst's couch. And just, I think that kind of separation of modes is very basic, but very vivid. Is important. And I think that the way that perhaps it bears on what's been going on over the weekend is not that there's anything specific to them, it's just that a person's creative cognitive facilities are sharpened.
Yeah.
And that might just be enough, and that could make a kind of difference. But I love that idea about something being missing, though, something kind of unrealised by the process. That you don't need it because it happens. You let your fingers run through it again.
I'll give you the next project as well. Okay, let's open this up a little bit. We've got half an hour before we have to close this. I think we're right on that schedule-ish. Has anybody got any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking over the weekend a little bit about the relationship between criticality on the one hand and on the other, we talked about effective experiences and the politics of feeling maybe, and the way that the formats of the different moments in the weekend have somehow juxtaposed these quite interestingly, and how you ended up listening to musical performances that provoked, like you say, these kind of emotional responses. And then Dieter brought up, you know, catharsis, and it was immediately problematic, I think. And I suppose my question is, you know, is it about, are we talking about kind of fusion of these things on the one hand, or are we talking about a sort of dialectic in which the criticality and the politics of feeling somehow push each other forward? I mean, I don't know, this is something that I've been, because I think that it's very easy to fall into this in self-indulgence, politics of feeling, you know, but at the same time it's there, and in John's performance there was, you know, with the piano, I was really attentive to that, you know, in relation to these very kind of strong, discursive, tough political terms that he used at a different moment. So this is something which I think is a question.
Yes.
Maybe for Francis.
Right.
You don't have to.
No.
But I can, and I'll say something. What strikes me very much in the course of my work is in relation to what am I deciding that I'm going to be or do, whatever it is I happen to be doing, in relation to what notions, what are the ones that guide me, and are they the same as the ones that are guiding others? What I said yesterday when Cornelius talks about singing the Internationale, we have all now realised that singing the Internationale is very complicated because certain kinds of people sing the Internationale and we'd really rather not know or have anything to do with it at all, but we won't necessarily know that while they're singing it. And so how are we going to have some notion of under what ideas we're working without then becoming one of those people? And I've just been developing a kind of framework for ethics and politics really for participatory theatre, suggested. And I looked at it and thought, well, how do I stop this from becoming a Stalinist dictatorship? Just because I've put words like democracy, dialogue into it, because that doesn't stop it. And so it's that kind of shifting and complex decision that you have to continually make over and over again, and asking questions in relation to something that seems to be central. That's everyone else to say about that.
Sorry,
I think that's where the issue of affect and criticality very sort of practically and rootedly is an issue, a very important one. There is a lot that gets written around the politics of feeling, increasingly kind of theoretical mode, that sometimes does end up perhaps being a little bit nebulous and vague. And it's an occupational hazard because you're talking about feelings, about affect. But rather than sort of shut the door on that, I mean, clearly there's a sense in which it's really important to recognise that if the responsibility of the critical attitude can't be in these kinds of instances to dictate a particular model or method. So there has to be a mode in which somehow, without being just vicarious and random and vague, that certain common notions can be put into some kind of place without being this kind of overarching sort of dictatorial way of producing knowledge. And I think the performances this afternoon, the idea of like the space that's freed up for thinking that you described before, I mean, that really is a very kind of concrete example of a kind of affective a critical relationship. When you go away to then sort of start writing that and sort of documenting that in some kind of theoretical form, that inevitably perhaps is where that might actually get lost. But there's still nevertheless there's a kind of like responsibility to not just say, well, you know, it's just about the moment, and therefore we're not going to try and sort of theorise it or think about it. There's a sense of a kind of a tension, a paradox, but one that has to be addressed without going to the extreme of just saying, well, it's all just affect, and without sort of just, you know, saying we can't talk about affect, we just do, and that's all that matters. There has to be something in between those two positions, I think.
I would echo that, and I often find with PhD students who are quite well into their practice, who you know, they're writing these very complex dissertations and bringing together kind of sociological thinking and scientific theories, kind of whatever. It's all like in there. It's all complex stuff all working together, and then I can say, well, you haven't mentioned anything about the music. You know, you've got this beautiful theoretical framework. But there's all this, you know, there's the whole kind of lineage of music that you're carrying with you. And when you hear your work, when I experience your work, it's hugely effective. Right? It's not in your map here, you know. And it's like, well, yeah, how do you? Is that something then you lay over the whole of this kind of network of stuff? Right? Suddenly it becomes a bit difficult. And then you think, gosh, actually, maybe the music actually isn't that sophisticated after all. There's a lot of things I can talk about. But, yes, metaphor.
But certainly in Cardew's work, I mean, as we've talked about across the weekend, there are moments where Cardew's work certainly wasn't very sophisticated. I mean, to the point of, you know, complete lack of sophistication. But it occurred to me that there's something about what we're talking about which is to do with pleasure, in a sense, and that doesn't go to it doesn't go as far as catharsis, which seems to be a bit redundant here. But you know, pleasure seems quite an interesting, and to acknowledge something pleasurable in the thinking that's been opened up. Maybe that's just as far as we can take it as well.
Really, I think John was saying there was really intriguing in terms of how anybody trying to provide a kind of intellectual autobiography of himself is pretty much opaque to what's been going on in their lives, and it might be with the musical images that their students are inhabiting, or people generally inhabit, might be so difficult. The only way to get around it is talking about something else entirely, in the hope that it might provide some kind of platform. And I think that's why the idea of the uninfluential comes so strongly forward. I mean, you can find yourself in odd situations remembering things, feeling things, but they're appearing to you as memories, but you've got no idea what that might mean to you. And so
But then there's those students that I was talking about, who aren't mine, with Beethoven on their shoulders, and they write these dissertations which are on a note-to-note level analysis of the work, with no theoretical construction, no theoretical underpinnings at all, which is kind of really odd.
But it's good, I know, it's good they do that, because it means that we do something else. You know, there's a kind of economy going, that's an economy for you. Adrian.
I hope this is an interesting contribution on the question of the pleasure, if you like, of something, coming back to Grant's question, the critical and criticality. But again, just something from the past. And I remember some dispute in the Cornelius' party, in our then party. And I used to always sing myself, it's my party and I'll cry if I want to, but, which wasn't the party song. But someone I did, and I can't remember what position Cornelius took on this, and I wish I could. Maybe John found it in his notes. But someone made some beautiful settings of two songs, one of which was the People's Flag, which is a dirge. People's flag is deepest red, shrouded up. It's about sacrifice and death and your blood flowing. It doesn't make you want to carry on. And someone made a beautiful syncopated version of it. So there was a kind of rhythmic split between the dramatic gloom of the song which tells that we're all going to die wrapped in our flags of day, and the musical quality, so that you could imagine dancing a kind of reggae kind of dance to it with a fifth beat, you know, and it made it quite wonderful. And there was the amount of consternation it produced within our little political circles about whether it stripped the working class of their dignity, it made light of sacrifice, and yet you could see precisely in that aesthetic era there was the possibility of the song becoming creative, critical, productive of thought about what you're doing rather than collective gloom, represented as if it were hope. And we don't know, in the end, we don't know when or why, how that's going to happen. And coming back to another thing I was saying yesterday about the work of poets, it isn't at all certain that what won't help most is not, I can't do this text right now, it's probably negative. It may be best just to listen to Beethoven. We don't know. And that comes a bit back to what Franz was saying. We really don't know. And it's that being prepared to accept the moment at which the sound does work. And I was thinking about that watching John directing, is it what it's, the first episode this morning. And all the way thinking through what was happening to his arm and the music, and whether it worked or not. And for that, to me, that was a wonderful critical space of reflection, absorption, and becoming slightly changed. So I think that question of not being ever frightened of aesthetic is kind of important. That comes back to what John was saying too, that your students seem to get scared of the music. In a way, perhaps.
Francis?
I was just going to give you a sample of the syncopated version.
Oh, go on then.
I don't sing very well, but I will do it anyway. It was no, I mean, Cornelius worked with people who could hardly sing in tune at all, so I think I'm probably in line with that. The people's flag is deepest red, it shrouded oft our martyred dead, and as their limbs grew stiff and cold, the red blood dyed its every fold, and raised the skull and
That's the original tune. That is what it was originally
That's
set
right,
to.
it's the original tune and it's syncopated.
Yeah, there's the white cocaine.
Flag will live
Did you do it,
die,
Rick?
the coward
Did you do
flinch
it?
and traitors sneer.
No,
but
the
keep
original
red
tune
flag
to which the
flying.
red flag was set, when it was when the words were first set, was the white
Really?
cocaine.
Yes.
It was syncopated originally. Ah, but it was very jolly sung like that, even with all the blood and stuff. I sang it for years like that, and then I went to a company where we did a lot of music, we used it.
Great. Thank you.
Anytime.
John?
I'm just wondering whether when we try and think Cardew in this context, there's certain points at which it feels like we are going, as you pointed out yesterday, to a kind of mythologizing, and therefore forgetting the contradictions and the authoritarianism, or however else we want to refer to it as. I'm wondering whether that, whilst necessary in some way to remind ourselves of the complexity of that moment, and for us who weren't there to know that there was something else happening as well, we can do that, but I'm wondering whether when we do that, we're also then producing a kind of limit, that we are designating it as such to then freeze it almost, to say, well, that's what it was, and that was the kind of problems there, and and therefore not to go back there in some way. I don't know. So I'm not quite sure what the self-critical reflection is going on in there. And instead, I'm wondering whether if we think about it as, or if we think about that name as a kind of designation, in the way in which a street name is a kind of designation. It doesn't really tell us anything about the street. So if we just have the name, we don't really know what the ground is like. So, but if we think about it as a designation, we have the possibility, perhaps, of lifting that limit so that we might see it as a beginning point for something. So to see the possibility of something else coming from it, I don't know. So I'm just...
If just to so I can be clear about what you're saying, that actually you're suggesting that the recognition of the contradictions within Cardew's history and what we know of him can act as a limit. That's what you're suggesting.
No, I'm saying that the way in which we embody that in the name of the person starts to produce a kind of limit. Whereas if we think about it as a designation of a kind of space, then when we have another way of thinking it.
Absolutely. And that's kind of very much why I'm interested in the spatial arrangements that have been going on as a kind of literal version of that, in a sense. Although perhaps if one pushed it too far, it would become too literal and then not interesting. But just to recognise the formats, and on a very basic level, to recognise the difference between the format in the theatre and the format in the lower gallery, for instance. I mean, it's interesting that there's a whole bit of stuff going on here. Stuff is a term I kind of regularly resort to, because and somebody is going to write a book about stuff, and then we're going to stop being able to use the term. But you know, the other stuff that's going on in the lower gallery is technically organised in a way that is competitive to this one, in the sense that it's suggesting a different way of thinking, different way of arranging bodies and space, in opposition to this one, which is kind of, you know, hierarchically organised, you know, panel discussion, you know, all those kind of things. And yet, of course, there are intimidations in both of them, as I tried to articulate by my telling off earlier on today, which I'm obviously still very hurt by, because I keep repeating it. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't quite gone away yet.
Sorry, it goes, I mean, it's part of the space, but it's also, there's a kind of like a discursive aspect as well.
Yeah.
Of course. And I was reminded of a couple of things, one connected to the other, which was that I wrote a note earlier on during the performances, which was a question, what does it matter who is singing? As a kind of deliberate, in my mind, echo of when Samuel Beckett wrote, somebody said, so what does it matter who is speaking? Somebody said, in quotes, what does it matter who is speaking? Which Michel Foucault quotes in his What is an Author? And what kind of strikes me about that in terms of this kind of perhaps a sidestepping and negotiating is not to suggest that it's not important who is singing necessarily, or that it's not important who is writing or who is thinking. In terms of the proper name, there's a sense in which strategically some kind of sideways manoeuvre is probably advised in order to situate, you know, the name, say, Cornelius Cardew within a kind of critical space where it's about the space, it's about the discourse, less than it's about, not just in the case of Cardew, but I mean, you know, whoever the example happens to be, a certain kind of, you know, a mythologisation described. And I think trying to work out ways in which it's possible to make that kind of sideways step as a kind of theoretical gestural manoeuvre is something I think is very important for the reasons that you point out.
I agree, and I think this idea of designation is really useful. But I also think that that's what we're doing here this weekend. We're attempting, you know, to think of Cardew as a designation rather than as a myth. I mean, it would seem very clearly that's what's written on the tin of the weekend, you know. Anybody got any other? And I would say that I think it's interesting. Somebody?
Sorry.
Hi.
I wasn't here yesterday. I'm from Switzerland. I'm just visiting from the European Graduate School there, which Peter Greenaway and Slavoj Žižek teach at. It's a sort of position of Americanism. I've got a question I'd like to hear your thoughts on, which is basically the place of the audience in the work, and just using Cardew as a sort of springing off point, because the audience used to have a very fixed place in sort of religious and industrial societies when you're going into listening to music. Today it no longer seems so, and I'm wondering how you feel about it. Can I add just a little thought that relates to what you were saying about the difficulties of singing something like the International? Sorry if am I out of a line now? That in Germany, about 8 years ago, I was talking with a group who said they felt very embarrassed now about doing something which they'd love to do, which was to sit around in a pub singing songs. But they could no longer do this because the Nazis had co-opted this kind of experience. And if the same thing's happening with the International, it's really rather sad. Thank you.
So, the audience? John?
Well, I keep thinking about Murray Schafer actually this weekend, because I tried to bring Murray Schafer to London 4 times now and failed each time. Anyway, one day he'll make it. But he's a similar kind of generation as Cardew, and as an interesting story, and the story continues with Schaeffer. And one of his, this isn't the story of kind of Marxism, it's a story of kind of ecological practice, kind of renewing of kind of sacred rites in music and so on. And he's someone who's destined, for a long time, thinking about that the relationship between audience, amateur, professional, and so on. And there's a very famous example of that, which is the Patria project, which has been doing every summer for about, I don't know, more than 10, maybe about 15 years now. Where this, to join it, you have to be initiated. You can't just come along, it's like joining the Rotary Club or something. The Masons are not quite sure. So you have to be invited along first, and then you meet in a car park, and then everybody walks for a day or so through the wilderness in Ontario. They walk over this hill, and at various points they split up around this lake. So we've got these two different communities on either side of the lake, and they have a totem pole. Sounding a bit dodgy now, isn't it? But they've got a totem pole, and everyone has a different job, like cleaning the toilets or cooking and so on. But everyone is also completely involved in working towards this performance, this performance event, which happens at dawn, and people come across the lake, there's people playing alpine horns, and the birds wake up, and so on. I mean, it sounds even worse now, but I haven't been there, because you can't just go along, and you can hear recordings. But
you want to bring him to London?
Well, I want to do it in Trafalgar Square. Silly me. But he's done it in Lisbon. Anyway, what's really interesting, and he's got other projects where he takes the audience through initiation processes through the night and so on, and he sits in the forest and then perform, and all kind of stuff. But anyway, he's someone who's absolutely really attempting to dissolve the difference between the platform, it's almost like a total Gesamtkunstwerk experience. Well, he's still the composer, kind of, although there's lots of improvisational processes and collaborative process music making. But
I think there's an important thing with Schaeffer and that group of Canadian experimentalists. I was often thinking of them as cartographers, mainly because that's how they sort of pronounce themselves. When they first came to Europe in the early 70s and came to the European Sound Diary, I thought there was an adventure there in trying to redefine listenership in some senses. There'd be descriptions of ways of working around Paris or London or Vienna or wherever they happen to end up, and it would be, here's a route, and walk into this gallery, listen for the squeaky floorboard in this stone spiral staircase. About halfway up, if you hum G, you'll find the eigentone in the room, in the tower. And the kind of series of these, the one that always gets me is stand by the fountain, kind of where it was in Paris. Listen to the relationship between that and the overflying aircraft. I think that was the most political gesture.
Regent's Park.
It was a Regent's Park. Oh, I'm sorry about that. But I thought that kind of investigation gave it another kind of listenership, because in some sense it demanded a technical prowess. And I think that it sits very interestingly against, I know Schaeffer was keen on John Cage, and lots of the experimental musical tradition has had this idea of a trivium of positions, if you like, that are allowed for people to perform, but there's a hierarchy of composer who composes, performer who listens attentively to the traditions of the performance and tries to figure out what's in the music and performs it, and at the bottom of it there's the cows, I suppose, the audience who sit around listening in a receptive kind of just tell me then, I don't know, just tell me kind of way. And Cage sort of argued at one point is that anybody can be composer and performer and listener. And at the moment, for him, the idea was that when you listen to Christian Wolf's music, you're all three, or perform Christian Wolf's music, you're all three at once. And I think that philosophical piling up gives a kind of incredible sort of status to the idea of in some senses you don't ever have a listener. The listener is always a composer, is always part of the performance, is always going to, how am I going to put these elements together? What am I going to make of it? Then finding out if that's a shared thing, and if that's going to be a shared thing, what do we make of that? And so new forms of consensualism develop and arise from that. And I love sometimes, like in fleeting moments, I think it's anarchistic, and on the other side, I think, well, that's how Trotskyism should have been.
Yeah, I was not sure when I was sitting in the audience today how I should be reacting, and I thought I would feel the same about the film, but it wasn't true, because the performers became the audience, it seems, at the end. They transformed themselves. They became appreciative of what they were doing. I don't know that that's how you felt it directly with people who were there.
I was reading some of the, sorry,
Sorry.
not a complete Cardew, I was reading some of his writings about the autumn piece, and it's great because he actually, he's writing about his own work as if he's a listener, a member of the audience. Saying, gosh, this can be an emotional experience, but how it's melancholic. Why is it so melancholic? And then, it's extraordinary how he manages to position himself as someone who's just come up off the street and sat down and listening to performances.
But there are, we need to be aware of the map. I'm thinking also about Francis's current research, but you know very well the kind of history of theatrical kind of versions of this desire to kind of bleed categories into each other, and sometimes very precocious and very precious, and potentially other ones are momentarily and temporally significant and then can't be repeated. There's many, but I'm kind of slightly nervous about that stuff in a sense, and I was interested in thinking. Kate, in the introduction to the drawing room catalogue, you talk about the moment in the workshop that we had. When there was an attempt, a workshop at the drawing room, which was a kind of precursor to this event in many ways, and to do with it was partly a kind of research day towards the drawing room show at the moment, as I remember it rightly, looking to you so you can explain it more adequately. But in your introduction to the catalogue of the drawing room, you talk about that particular moment where we were all given things to perform with, and we all felt incredibly uncomfortable, because of the whole kind of. But there was something very interesting about that, because whereas maybe in the Schaefer performances and within, I think about people like Garzynicza as a kind of theatre version of it, or a set of kind of Polish theatre companies coming out of the 80s and 90s that I remember being involved with, that there was this kind of whole ritualistic, the improvisation rites effectively that have happened in very different formats in different places, and yet what's quite interesting about this sudden kind of retort to joining in that occurred in the drawing room, a very kind of violent act in many ways, completely the opposite of the ways in which we are normally induced into those spaces, was it produced a very different effect. And actually there was something quite productive about it. It was much, much more interesting than the one in which one is kind of gently led into the capacity to participate. So it was very interesting.
It was a discomfort that it triggered, wasn't it? Which again then therefore led on to another series of kind of discussions. It was that awkwardness that was needed. It was all a bit cosy until that time, and then you suddenly had to confront this reality of what this crazy box of tricks that she brought out and was all expected to put on hats and blow whistles and so it kind of broke the ice, and it just changed, put things up to a different kind of.
Can I ask a question? Did it generate, after the initial sort of discomfort, is there a sense in which kind of collective relationship was established? No.
No, we did it for a bit, but just long enough to make us feel like we'd done it properly, which probably wasn't, and then we kind of retorted, we kind of went back to our positions and carried on regardless. Absolutely not.
No, my reason for asking that, I've had an experience like that at the Guelph Jazz Festival in Canada last year, when there was this Cuban public theatre performance where they basically sort of did a kind of carnival from the venue to the centre of the town, and they just foisted these kind of like miscellaneous sort of DIY instruments onto people, which is like, and there was that sense of like, you can imagine this kind of utopic fantasy of like, we all get to be the musicians, we all participate in the parade. The sense in which it's like prompting your hand and you're like, what do I do with this? And there's this real sort of kind of discomfort, but there's a sense in which, and it also goes back to the kind of political question, I guess, in a way, in the sense you kind of fold in with it, and then you become part of the rhythm and the movement, and there is something really sort of quite powerful, very immersive about it. But you have to imagine there's also something potentially probably quite dangerous about that kind of activity. One is reminded, I guess, of drums and trumpets, and the kind of, whoever it was yesterday, was it Kodwo who talked about kind of, military and militarism.
Yes.
So there's always that kind of flip side, isn't there?
Yeah. And Angelica, then back to Francis. Angelica.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Francis was saying about the kind of ethics of kind of, and Grant's point about the politics of cleaning. And I've just been thinking about many things, but just in relation to this orchestra that I was working with for 2 years, one of the things that I had to protect, I felt, was the struggle for things to protect things from not being good, right? So people were, the theatre organisation that I was working in kind of thought of bringing all these people together as a way for them to participate and be good, right? For them to participate and produce this kind of language of improvisation that would, you know, essentially lead to something good. And I kind of had to protect the musicians in a way to allow them to be bad, to allow them to dislike each other in a way, to allow these antagonisms to emerge.
Absolutely.
And I think that is very important.
I absolutely agree.
In relation to maybe the kind of, you know, the tyranny of someone like Cardew or whatever. I mean, sometimes these things are important. You can't, you know, being good is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Being good is not good enough.
Might
Being
be
good is
a
not
bit
bad
of
enough.
the bandaging of Bernardo Coleman's hands
Yes.
and protecting him from the discussion yesterday as well.
Yeah.
Well, that he was, in pain, but had to carry on.
Yeah. Francis.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about structure, doesn't it? To what happened at the drawing room when Carol produced that
Yeah.
stuff, and I was in the conspiracy, I have to say, was that there was a real break in the mode, wasn't there? Because it showed what you hadn't done,
Yeah.
what wasn't there, but what was coming out of that tradition and line of work. And yesterday, at the end of the Ultra Red performance, somebody asked the audience to make images, and they hadn't done it. And they all got very, very uncomfortable, and something odd happened in the space, whereas something else could have happened in the space. It didn't destroy anything, it was just kind of what happened. It was about something to do with what sort of frameworks were in place, what might have allowed people or encouraged them to make images at that moment, even if they hadn't done it all the way through, that it was sort of organic. I went to see the Dutch Roman plays the night before last, and I thought there was something quite awful about it. And at one point they did Friends, Romans, Countrymen, and Romans, Countrymen and Lovers, Brutus's speech to the crowd followed by Antony's. They made it quite clear there was no crowd because they did it as if it was on television. And at one point Brutus says something like, who is it here that does not love his country? I wanted to put my hand up. It was a theatre full of people. I was desperate to interrupt, and I could not do it. And because I'm a theatre worker and all the rest, all of those things, I could not interrupt. I was forbidden to interrupt. It was very, very uncomfortable and very peculiar what they'd done, and I thought very unpleasant. And so we're talking about how we look at things and what choices we make. I mean, the choice that everybody became uncomfortable was quite a good one in that situation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There was nothing wrong with it.
No, not at all.
But it was uncomfortable. So how do we make the choices we make, and how do we think about them, and how do they change? I mean, next week we might be a different decision, maybe.
But there is something about the right to not join in that
Yes,
seems to be quite
there
important
is.
as well, which is like the right not to learn to play the tune or whatever.
Yeah, because there's always going to be
Yes.
somebody in control who you might completely disagree with, or
Yeah.
the setup that you might completely disagree with
Yeah.
and not want to participate in.
Yeah.
So why not be angry with that and not participate?
Yeah. But the other things that have happened in theatre, which are moving towards the Freyerian model of theatre, which is more like what Ultra Red is doing,
Yes.
and into
Because
Augusta
they're very
Boal.
influenced by prayer.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, Augusta Boal, whose work
Yeah.
I've done a lot, actually turned the audience into the performers, either directly or as the people on stage effectively were part of the audience. And it reminded me of that moment in the Romanian switch from Ceausescu, when they took radio and television stations over, and suddenly everybody was watching themselves on television and listening to themselves on the radio for a short period of time.
Yeah.
And that was a very Boalian moment, because that was when the audience stormed the stage, took it over and spoke to itself.
That's a very, I mean, it's very interesting. You can talk. I mean, there's a very different form of participation involved in Boal. You know, very differently productively. Interesting. Sorry, I was just going to see if anybody else got any things they want to throw in, questions, comments on.
Well, I would just throw in a point as we sort of starting point with this Cardew. my first experience of hearing a work of his was a radio broadcast of the first performance of Paragraph 1 of Great Learning, which involved a discussion afterwards about the question of audience participation, because it was received quite noisily. There was a section of the audience made quite a bit of a fuss about it. And what Cornelius had to say afterwards was that, on the question of audience participation, that those members of the audience who were sitting and listening intensively were really participating up to the hilt. And this thing about a hierarchy between the composer, the performers and the audience is not something I think that Cardew would have recognised very well. At least he would have fought against.
Yeah.
Because for him, the audience was very much a part of the musical experience.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's not that he wouldn't recognise it. It's one that he set himself up absolutely to try and change that.
Yeah, but nonetheless, at the college, at Morley College experiment music classes, he always had his desk, which he sat behind as a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to go back to John's point about mythologizing. And, when you were saying that, I suddenly wanted to affirm the notion of mythologizing. And I was like thinking, then trying to think of a way to do that. And I was recalling this text by Wu Ming, which is this group of Italian theorists who write very interestingly about the necessity for mythology. And that political activity needs mythologies in order for it to be kind of propelled forward as a kind of motor. And the example they use is this, the Luther Blissett project, which was to take this person who was a footballer, had no relationship in a sense to politics, and then make him the nom de plume for activists to speak about politics. And I'm just maybe going back to what Adrian said about getting it wrong. Maybe it's also sort of permissible to mythologize Cardew in a sense, in a way, if it allows for the production of incorrect interpretations and a kind of excess that's not about simply historicizing.
Yes.
Actually, what you're saying is what I'm trying to say, which is that a mythologizing that produces a limit is not what I'm interested in. It's the way in which one can make it productive. I think that the way in which the idea of mythologizing was being presented, it was Andrea that mentioned it yesterday, could produce it as a limit. I think that it's possible to think it differently, and I think in that sense we're not disagreeing.
Yeah, and I think we've been quite careful in this discussion, and also in the various stages of the project that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
I think that has been very. Like for example, particularly with the participation of Adrian, he was constantly undermined the persona of Cardew throughout. I have to say, we've always brought that into question in a way that's never allowed it to become kind of rhapsodic and limited.
It was very interesting what Victor said yesterday, I thought, because if anyone's in a position to say without embarrassment, I loathe the music.
Yes.
Yeah. At the same time, to have done everything in the world to make visible, and in doing that, to make visible to himself something of totally different and lasting value.
Yeah.
And I found that quite a moving moment when
you
said that, actually.
And to think, I think of Victor, you talked about him as a kind of impresario for Cardew, which feeds my desire always to think of the economic formats through which we might be working. But there's something very interesting in that, to go back to the Luther Blissett model, which I think is an extraordinarily kind of interesting contemporary invention. What's interesting about the mythology, what Luther Blissett do very cleverly is they put mythologization on the table on the basis of it having the supposition of contradiction already implicit within its structure, because we know that it's a collective mythologization. So that's why it's an interesting invention, and that's why. So that's the kind of version of mythology that we can work with. because we know that it has an assemblage at its base rather than a kind of unification of anything, in a sense. Which
it's
is
collective from
yeah.
the base, actually.
And we also know, if we're to believe the blogs, that there is quite a lot of disagreement going on within the, and of course that might be part of the mythology itself as well. But it seems to me that's an interesting format. So it's very interesting to think about, for instance, that as a kind of contemporary version of Cardew.
Yeah.
To think about the relationship between the Blizzard and Cardew would seem to be a very productive thing to do, yeah. And you want, Rob, you want, we cut you off.
I was going to say something like that.
Oh, sorry. Any other thoughts or questions? That seems quite an interesting moment to kind of to kind of end in a way. I don't like ending, but we have to.
I think it's a good time to
Yeah.
end, yeah. So
Great.
thank you very much, everybody, for your thoughts and for all the audience participation as well. So, thank you.